Hi everyone and welcome to another video. I think this is my favorite video to make every year. For lots of people that is the best books of the year. For me that is my stats. I like keeping track of stats. Of all the information surrounding my books. I've got a pretty extensive Excel sheet and it keeps growing every year. You might think that once I put in the effort a lot of things I would only have to track the books, but the pie charts and stuff would all already be done, but each year I find a little thing that then improves how the charts are made. I can talk to you about my Excel sheet if you want at one point, but right now let's just dive into the stats. There's a big difference in my stats compared to the previous years, and that is that this year I noted how many pages each book was, and if I'm then, for example, comparing the languages that two books are written in, I took into account the pages and not the number of books, so that one book of 1,000 pages would weigh more than one other book of 200 pages. So look out for that if you're interested. Well, let's just dive into the numbers. You might see me glance in that direction often because that is where my computer screen is with all my charts. Numbers first. Last year I have read 73 books, which is less than I think the 3 previous years, but that number is really just a number for me. I don't really care about it. I don't think there was any big slumpiness. It was just, this year was 73 books. That's it. I would have preferred it to be 75 because that is a rounder number, and 75 is just satisfying in itself. It's not just rounder, it's just, you know, it's 0.75%. Nah, anyway, in pages that comes down to 28,563 pages. Because I haven't tracked the pages the previous years, I don't know how that compares. It could be that in pages I read just as much as, let's say, 3 years ago when I think my book count was at 83. But we shall never know, because I'm not planning on looking up those numbers for all of those books. I'm not planning on doing that. Now, 73 books, and I also DNF'd 8 books, and those books are not taken into account in the pages. Now that I know what the sizes of books are, I can also show you this information. Now, I've read 12 books that were between 0 and 200 pages. Not that much. The biggest chunk would be the books that are between 200 and 350 pages. I've read 26 books of that length. 19 were between 351 and 500. 11 were between 500 and 700, and 6 were more than 700 pages. Which means that my average comes up at comes at 386 pages, and I'm really proud of this. I like that that number is high. It really makes me happy. I like that big books are some things that I'm really keen to pick up, and that it doesn't mean that I will then pick up a lot of small books to compensate. Now, I have to say though that I read War and Peace last year, and the copy that I had was French, and it was split up into 2 volumes. And because I read it partly in French, partly in English, because I read it partly in print, partly on audiobook, I decided to say that I read 2 books of 1,000 pages because the 2 volumes were each 1,000 pages. So in my stats I took into account 2 books of each 2,000 pages. No, 2 books of each 1,000 pages, and then 1 in English and audio and 1 in French in print. So that the number says 6 books that are more than 700 pages. If you see War and Peace as 1 book, then that would only be 5 books. War and Peace is incidentally the biggest book that I have read, with 2 times 1,000 pages, and the smallest is the Penguin Green Idea book by Wangari Maathai called The World We Once Lived In, which has a very small 68 pages. I could also track how many pages I've read per month. That's what you see here. Globally, I'm always between 2,000 and 3,000, except for June, where it's above the 4,000 marks, and May is a lot less, but I think that is because right now, and I'm changing that for 2023, the pages are added to the month where I finished the book. So it's very, I think that in May and June I was reading one of the Robin Hood fantasy trilogies, and I think that at least one book of 800 to 900 pages when I added to June, because I finished it maybe on the 1st or the 2nd of June. So that explains that. Then we've got a small dip in November as well, which makes sense because I was on holiday then and did not read that much. And a small one in February, which is probably because February is a little bit smaller and I was moving house then. But overall, quite consistent. To me, an important part of my reading is keeping track of the countries that I read and the languages that I read in. So these are my favorite pages. This chart shows how many books from authors from different countries I have read. Overall, I've read books from 30 different countries, and 8 of those countries were new to me. So the green countries are countries that I previously read, and the little blue ones, I have to say there are a lot of actually small ones. You will not even notice Bangladesh over there because it's blue between the green. The blue ones are countries that are new to me. Now, I'm proud of these, so I'm just gonna say the name of all the countries, just bear with me. And by the way, you can also see how many books I've read for each of those countries. So you've got the US, England, Russia, the Netherlands, Jamaica, India, France, Ireland, Belgium, Guyana, new to me, Uganda, new to me, Ukraine, new to me, Canada, Scotland, Afghanistan, Algeria, South Korea, El Salvador, new to me, Bangladesh, new to me, Norway, Angola, new to me, Ghana, Nigeria, the Republic of Congo, new to me, Rwanda, new to me, Zambia, Japan, Senegal, Australia, and Kenya. Now, when we look at those numbers, obviously the US and England are big because when I pick up a mystery, when I pick up a fantasy, they will probably be from authors from those countries because those are the books that I'm exposed to. They are ranked in the amount of pages that I read. That's why Russia with 2 books is higher up than the Netherlands with 5 books, because the Russian books would have been bigger. Anyway, so the Netherlands, we've only got 5 books from Dutch authors. I live in the Netherlands, so surprised that that number is not higher, but I mean, I didn't pick up many of those books, and I think some of those were rereads even. And another one that I'm disappointed by is France. I've only read 3 books from French authors, and I'm French, so this number is low. But yeah, I'm happy about the amount of countries and about the amount of new countries. When we look at my reading around the world, in totality, those 8 countries are added to my reading around the world map, which is this one. In total, I have read books from authors from 78 different countries. All of the green countries in this map. Now, I have to say, some of these countries, Italy, for example, Italy is a good example. While I have read a book by an Italian author, that book really did not tell me anything about Italy, and it could have been set in another European country. Still happy about this map, and I'm looking forward to coloring it in even more. For that, Brazil and Greenland are big spots, so might tackle them. Continents. Let's talk continents first, because you can group countries by continents, and then you see that half of the reading that I do is from European countries and 30% by North American countries. It is more than what it was last year. The chart on the right bottom corner is what it was in 2001. Then the 2 total were, let me see, 37 and 26. So that's 35, yes? Yes. No, 33, 63%. Gee, math, thank you. So it's a little bit more than ideally what I would want it to be, but I'm glad that the other continents there's not one that really sticks out too much. So we've got Africa at 8%, Asia at 63%, which, well, I mean, that's not a lot. Asia's huge. I haven't divided in East or Central or West Asia, so Asia is very small for the amount of countries that are in Asia. We've got Central America, and then the 3 slivers that don't have any names would be Oceania, South America, and the Middle East, probably the Middle East. Not a lot of reading from those continents. It is what it is. Now we go to languages. As you can see, 70%, well 71% of my reading, which was 58 books, was originally from a book written, let me try to say that again, was originally written in English. Why that is more than just the US and the UK and Canada maybe combined is because we've also got a lot of books that were written in some of the African countries or in India or in Australia that were written in English. So it makes sense for that number to be quite high. Russian also is very high up there. So we've got 3 books that were originally written in Russian, which comes in at 8.4%. And then, only then, do we have the Netherlands, Dutch and French. Seeing that those are languages I also read in, I'm not happy with these numbers being quite so low. So only nearly 8% and nearly 6% of the books were originally written in either Dutch or French. If you remember, I've read 3 books from French authors, but some countries in Africa are old colonies of France, so some of those books would also be written in French. Except for those 2, we have Hindi, Korean, Spanish, Portuguese and Norwegian, which I've all read 1 book from, and then depending on how big that book was, you see that their slice of the pie is bigger or smaller. So Hindi is bigger because Tomb of Sand was quite a big book. Now what I'm really proud about is that, first, 9 of those books were translated. Not that much, so that's the Japanese, Norwegian, Portuguese, Spanish, Korean and Hindi, and the Russian for the rest. I read everything in the original language that it was written in, and I'm really happy about that. I hate that sometimes in the past I would read a book in a language that I could have read the original. Translation does do something to the book, and if you can not have that, then that's a great thing to do. And I was curious because I knew that it used to be more of a thing in the past, and I was really paying attention to that, how my numbers would compare to what I did in 2001 and 2002, which was why we have got this table, this information. Now, the numbers, the percentages are not necessarily percentages, but I try to take into account the total amount of books that I read that year. Otherwise, for example, you can see the amount of new countries. This year I read 8 books from new countries, but and in 2000 it was 20, but in 2000 I read twice as much as I did this year, so it makes sense to take that into account. And then we see that I'm rather stable. Last year was a little bit more. Overall, the amount of countries I read by has gone up. When you look at original languages, that has been pretty stable over the years. The amount of translated books has gone down this year, which is interesting, that the original language is the same, but then amount translated has gone down. That's interesting. That's interesting to me. And this is the number that I'm really happy about, and one that I pay attention to is the translated cheat. So when I read a translated book, but I shouldn't have, you see that it's 0 this year, and last year it was 5, and the year before 18, so 5%, 12%. So I'm glad about that, and I really want to keep I do, it is important to me, and I don't think it's something I need to tell myself not to do. It's just important to me. So I want to keep that the way it is. Last chart, when it comes to languages, is the language I read in. I'm able to read books in English, French, Dutch and German, and now I could also say sort of a little bit Portuguese if it's not too complicated Portuguese. Last year, however, I only read in English, French and Dutch. No German, did not manage to do that. You see, maybe if you really come close to your screen in the 2 charts from 2001 and 2000, there's a little green sliver. That's my 1 German book of that year. But if we look at the other 3 languages, there's a lot of English in there. 78% this year, that is way too much. French and Dutch being both lower than 15 is not something that I'm happy about at all. Last year I remember focusing on picking up more books that were written in French, and this year I did not pay attention to that at all. And apparently then it goes really down. Maybe it's also because I tried to not buy too many books, and my library does not have a lot of French ones, so it makes sense, but this is not something that I want. Reading in French is one of the few ways I have to keep that language up. And if you see the other years, it was 25 and 10 or 25 and 15. So I'm able to do this. This is just a thing. Then we have got stats more about the author. Gender, it's not really something that I am interested in that much, to be honest. The only thing really that interests me in this one is the non-binary authors. As you can see, I don't really, well, you might not be able to see, but I've also read books from transgender male, transgender female, but it feels weird to put them in transgender categories. So right now I've grouped them in male or female. I might change that at a later point, but overall the majority of my reading is by female authors. Ethnicity, another hard one, harder than gender. The reason I take track of ethnicity because I don't want all of my reading to just be by white authors. But these are not all the ethnicities that there are at all. These are just categories that I decided upon, and I don't know for most of these authors if this is also what they would put themselves in if they could choose. So that's important to take into account when you look at these numbers. Overall, a lot of the authors that I read from are white. We've got 66%, and then 17% of the authors that I read are black, and we've got South Asian and East Asian both at around 6.5%, Arab at 2.3%, and the sliver that you can't see the name of is probably Hispanic. Overall, I've read more from white authors than last year, which I hadn't realized necessarily. It makes sense because a lot of my reading this year, as you will see, has been fantasy, and those are all just really white British authors. So yeah, those just take up a lot of my reading. Genre, as I said, so you can see both the genre more specifically and the fiction, non-fiction. Let's start with the genres. As I just said, fiction was a large part of my reading last year, 28%. That is a lot more than it used to be. I think the years before it was maybe at around 10-15%. Then we've got literary fiction at 17%, classics 12%, where honestly War and Peace is just War and Peace just counts when you take into account pages, so it makes sense that classics is so big. Historical fiction 11.5%. It's less than what it's been in other years, but I don't really have an opinion about this other than, well, fantasy might be a little bit much. Contemporary fiction at 6.4%. Then we've got middle grade. I think those are probably just the Harry Potter books that I've read at the end of the year. Let me think. Is there any other middle grade that I don't know. Could have also put them in under fantasy, but it made sense to put them in middle grade. Let me just put it that way. We've got some history books. Those were probably non-fiction. Then we've got science fiction and other smaller genres that probably only read one book in. Now, when it comes to just fiction, non-fiction split, this year I read less than 10% books that were non-fiction, well, pages, not necessarily books. And that's a lot less than what it used to be, and that's also a lot less than what I want it to be. Last year it was 15%, and the year before it was 25%. Again, those were books, but still, it's rather small this year. Maybe at a later point in the year I will focus a little bit more on non-fiction because I do like it a lot. As I said, most of these numbers take into account the number of pages that I read, and with the genres you can really see how that impacts the pie chart. On the left we have the pie chart when you take into account the pages, and on the right we have, I hope that's also right and left for you, otherwise just look at the title of the thing. Yes, it's going to be left and right for you. On the right we have when we take into account the number of books. Now, fantasy books tend to be big. Yes, I know. So you see there's the biggest difference. Fantasy is 28% when you look at pages. When you just look at the amount of books, then it's only 19%. So that might also account for the difference with the previous years, where, as I said, it was around the 15% mark. Literary fiction is a little bit smaller, and for the rest, classics is a lot smaller when you look at books, and for the rest it's approximately the same. Just for the other charts, by the way, the resemblance was a lot stronger. Medium. This is the medium in which I read a book. So on the left we have 51% of the books I read as an actual physical copy, and then we've got 46% of the books were audio and only 3% which were ebook, which is very small. It's a lot smaller also than the year before. The year before, in 2021, is the chart you can see on the left bottom corner, where ebooks were nearly 8% of my reading, but ebooks just haven't really worked for me, and I think the only ebooks here are the ones that I took with me while I was on holiday. Audio has really grown. I've just been able to just read a lot of audio this year, maybe also because a lot of my audio reading was the fantasy, when I was just listening away, having a blast. Now, when I look at how many of those pages I actually own, we see that 57% of the books, of the pages I own, 31 I do not own, 6.4 are ones that I used to own but have since then put away, given away, something like that, probably put in a free library or given to either my mother or my grandmother. Nearly 3% are books that I still want, that I liked enough to want. I know one of those is The Ice Palace by Tadej Vissas, and the light green sliver, the lime one. Those are books that I wanted and have since then got. Let me see, it means that a lot more of the books are ones that I've owned, because last year that used to be, what's that number? 41, I think, percent. And probably one of the main reasons that there's this difference, knowing that a lot of the books were audiobooks, I mean, that wouldn't make sense, right? It would make sense for the audiobooks to be books that I don't own, but some of those books were books that I did own, but I wanted to read on audio because for reason X, Y, or Z, because I was rereading them probably, and this was a good medium to get to them. So I'm happy that a lot of the books are books that I own, because it means that I'm reading stuff that is on my shelves. Oh, obviously books that I have put away, it would be better if that was less, because it means that I buy books that I don't necessarily want to have. And the want and gotten can be bigger, because that would mean that books that I've gotten from the library or via my audiobook service are ones that I like, really like. So happy about this. Now, when we see where those books came from, 42% of the pages are pages that I actually bought myself with my own money or something like that. Same amount, about approximately 42%, are books that I listened to via the audio service of Script. Then we've got 7.7% books that I adopted, so those were that either a friend was putting them away and I put up my hand when they said, "Who wants these?" or that I found them in a free library. Only 6% for my library. Not much. I have hardly used the library last year, I have to admit. And then we've got the lime green and the orange ones were probably books that I was either gifted or that I read as an ebook that I lent from the library, or as an ebook that I got from Script. Ebook from Script. This is different than what it was before. I think in the previous years I read a lot more books that were from the libraries. You can see it was at least 11% last year, and I know last year was not that much. And Script audio has also gone up, as you can see. Now we can also see when I actually got those books. NO stands for that I don't own them. So it could be that a book that I read via Script is now in another category, because I might have it on my shelves. So a quarter of my reading are books that I got in 2022, which is good. It means that I'm reading books as they come in. 16% for 2021, then we've got 5% for 2020, 19% for 8% for 2009, and 4 books are books that I owned previous to 2009 when I started studying, and 40%, as I said, books that I did not own. I read less books from the current year than last year. Last year, 30% of the books that I read are from 2021, but I'm not mad about it, because the 2019 and 2020 slivers are a little bit bigger than they were before, relatively, so it means that I do also try to pick up the older books on my shelves. And I actually remember in the first quarter I made a point of trying to read books that I had previous to 2020, I believe. So liking this chart. Let's look at when these books were published. As you can see, a big chunk are books that were written between 1950 and 1999. These are all of the Lord of the Rings and probably also War and Peace. So it makes sense that that is a big part of my chart. Then we've got a very small number that was published between 1900 and 1949. And for the rest, I have to say that the sliver between 2000 and 2015, so those 3 are quite similar. And then we've got the rest of the chunk are books that are written between 2016 and 2018. That is approximately the same to the published in 2019, published in 2020, published in 2021, and published in 2022. I am very surprised each year at the amount of books that I read that have actually also been published this year, because that's not something that I seek out at all. I don't seek out new publications, but because looking at other people's booktube videos, those tend to be about new publications, so those then become books that I'm interested in or that I can read via script very easily. And this also goes to showing how much you're influenced by what you see other people, what you hear other people talking about, because once again, this is not something that I look for, but it does become a very big part of my reading just because I hear others talk about it. So this chart, I believe, shows that very well. Star rating, I've grouped them a little bit because I use quarter stars as well. You want to make the difference between a 4.5 book and a 4.75. That just really means something different to me. But however, to make this chart a little bit more easy to understand and not to have too many values, I have grouped them a little bit. I have read very little books. I looked at books for this one. Very little books that I rated between 0 and 2.25. I think there was only one book that I rated 2 stars, and the reason I read that one is that it was before a book club. Then we've got a little bit more than 20. I rated between 2.5 and 3.25. Largest amount, those might probably be about 38 maybe books between 3.5 and 4.25. I'm happy about this because I think 3.5 is when I start seeing books as, yes, I appreciated you. 4 is just a fine. So this is good. This shows that I had a good year, I think. And then we've got more than 10 books that I rated between 4.5 and 5 stars. Some of these, by the way, were ratings. When I looked at all of the books that I gave 5 stars to, I think 2 or 3 were rereads, which I'm happy about. It means that some of the books that I used to love are still ones that I do love. Last but not least, we have stuff surrounding projects and buddy reads. I read some books for projects like The Invisible Cities, which is a big part of my reading. I've read 11 books purely for Invisible Cities. 10 books were rereads. Then I've got the 4 very small. They're 4 books, but they're really not even 400 pages. That for the Penguin Green Ideas book. I want to read 1 book from Jane Austen every year and 1 book by Kazuo Ishiguro each year, which you can also see. Kazuo Ishiguro was a very small book. And then we've got 1 book that I read for, I've got a friend who lives in another city, and that they've got this awesome program where each month you're encouraged to read a book and then you watch the film adaptation, or a book that a film that has to do with that book. So I've read one of the book for that. I've read 1 book for that last year, and I've also read 1 book for that this year already. When we look at buddy reads, this is where also the book club books are featured. I've read only 6 books with my book club, which is not a lot because we've got 12 books each year, and I even have to say that I know at least 1, maybe 2 that I didn't even go to the evening, which is sad. I love my book club. I travel in the public transport for 1.5 hours each way just for this, and then that only being 6 books is not that great. I've only buddy read 1 book with someone for the Invisible Cities project. VB Rotterdam was a book club that I was shortly a part of in the city that I used to live in. I've buddy read 1 book with Eva, Paula, Gijs and Katja each now, except for Gijs, the 2 book and the other 2 book clubs. All of these other buddy reads have been booktube induced, which is nice to hear. And Paula, we should read more books together. 1 over a half year, knowing that we are bookish BFFs, so that's BBFFs, is not enough, actually, I think. This concludes my video about all of these stats. Overall, I'm happy about the stats that I have tracked. There are already a couple of things that I know I want to track differently. I'm not talking about the books right now because I've already talked about the books in other videos, but stats-wise, a couple of things that I want to track differently are when I have read the actual pages. So right now, at the end of each month, I look at where I am in the books that I'm reading at that moment, and I'm also going to keep tracks of books that I DNF. They're not that many, but you know, it might still, it would still make my data more accurate, and I like that. Another thing that I still want to think about what I do with it is the ethnicity of authors, because it just doesn't sit right with me, but at the same time it's still something that I want to look at. And genres. Some books just have multiple genres, and it feels weird to then just put them in one category, but other books do only have one genre that I am interested in, at least that I want to have in my stats. So I don't know what to do with that. I don't know. Maybe I'm gonna change everything. Gee, the autofocus of my camera has been crap, hasn't it? I'm sorry you've had to look at a partly blurry me, but you were here for the numbers anyway. I'm going to stop talking. I hope you enjoyed this video. If there are other things that you would be interested in me tracking, let me know, because I'm always in for new ideas. And I'm also thinking of making a video where I look at how my reading has been for the past, let's say 7 years, because I have some stats for some of those 7 years. Let me know if you would be interested in that, because then I can prioritize it. Or just do it. Maybe that's the thing. Let me know. I'll talk to you in the comments. By the way, if you're still here, I have been crap about replying to comments. I'm really sorry about that. I promise I will do better. Bye bye.
Ba-chum, ba-chum, chum.